This video lecture is going to address the different issues and developmental milestones that you would expect to see in the toddlerhood developmental stage. It can be an interesting debate sometimes for people to determine what age are we talking about when we talk about toddlers. And generally speaking, when an infant grows and develops to the point where they can move around and walk around and therefore toddle, that begins the developmental phase known as toddlerhood. And there are a lot of highlights and changes happening in this age range from about 1 to 3. You're seeing rapid physical, mental, and verbal growth, and this allows the child of this age to have a lot more engagement with the world than they previously had as an infant. And because they're out there exploring and getting into things and experimenting and having new experiences, they're starting to figure out the world. And of course, one of the major benefits, potentially, of developing the skill of walking means that you can now become much more independent from your parent or caregiver. If you feel like walking away from them, you can walk away from them. If they ask you to join them and walk with them, you can say no and walk in your own way. And so this newfound independence is both wonderful and honestly a little scary for kids of this age. But it's a major shift from the total dependency of infancy. Between the ages of 2 and 3, you're already starting to see a beginning sense of self, particularly around issues of identity like gender identity and racial differentiations. That is partly a child becoming more aware of oneself and partly becoming more aware of the world around them. And they're also beginning to have a very interesting cognitive shift where they can symbolically represent in play and language, meaning they can hold on to ideas and they can become a little bit more abstract, and instead say of sitting down and stacking blocks into a tower, they can now take their blocks and actually make a house. And they can talk about, this is so-and-so's bedroom, and this is the kitchen, and this is the living room where we watch TV. And they can start to see, rather than just a tower, that they can symbolically represent their house, for example. And that's an interesting and important cognitive shift because that means that they can think about those things and remember those things and call those things up even though those things might not be right in front of them. And so with all of these gains, these cognitive, emotional, and social gains, this is also happening in all of the biological growth and development that's happening, and there's all kinds of interaction with the environment that wasn't there before during infancy. I think sometimes you could conceptualize growth and development as a series of concentric circles. During infancy, that child's world is very, very, very small. That child and select few caregivers. But with every developmental stage, that world widens more and more. And so a toddler, for example, might have playdate friends, or might be going out and about and seeing extended family more often, or maybe they're going to daycare, or some of these other experiences that are widening these concentric circles. And then you see that more in middle childhood, early childhood, certainly in adolescence, when teenagers are wanting to really get out more into the world, just this widening of these circles. And the first really major shift in that is in toddlerhood. So, what's big in toddlerhood? Toilet training. Lots of debate about how to best go about that. It seems as though the most common advice is to try to take your cues from the toddler themselves and see if you can encourage something that they're into. It's generally speaking discouraged to try to force something that a kid is not ready to do. But toilet training has all kinds of psychodynamic history attached to it, but it really, again, refers to issues around control and independence. it's really kind of a big deal when you can take care of that for yourself and not be dependent on somebody to change your diaper and clean you up. It's no small accomplishment for a toddler to be able to successfully manage those things themselves. And it also means that they might experience for the first time shame and embarrassment if there's problems or mistakes, and how, of course, the world around them manages those problems and mistakes is plays an enormous role in how well they do with continuing that developmental gain. But certainly compared to the kind of clumsy, off balance walking around of, say, a 1 year old, by the time kids are going 1, 2, 3, you're seeing a lot more complexity in their running and their jumping and their climbing. They may have a tricycle or some other kind of little bike where they're doing some pedaling. These are all major motor skills, gross motor skills primarily. And then you're seeing now the development also of better fine motor skills, hand-eye coordination, being able to hold their own spoon or their own fork, being able to color and hold the crayon or the pencil. And obviously, even in this developmental period of toddlerhood, there's a big difference between a 1 year old and a 3 year old, and you can see how that improvement happens. And these are, important things to be aware of with some kids. The world can be a very frustrating place for kids who have some kind of motor skill delay. And something interesting that's also happening from an emotional and kind of cognitive sense is kids at this age can start to show reciprocity and empathy with other kids. So one of the ways that you see that is in their play. When you work with kids or when you study kids or think about kids, watching them in their play is a really enormous source of information. Parallel play refers to a style of play where two toddlers, usually pretty young children, sit near each other, but they're doing their own thing. They're not particularly interacting with one another. One kid might be playing with blocks and one kid might be playing with cars. They're with each other and they're aware of each other, but they're not interacting, they're just doing their own thing. Interactive play means, as it sounds, that you are not doing your own thing. You're trying to collaborate and work together to play a game or to do a little activity or something along that line. And to be able to do that is actually a really major shift in being able to do things like take turns, work out little conflicts in the play about how you want things to go, and also the building blocks of empathy. If you grab a toy away from a child and that child cries, you might have to think about that and notice that. And again, those are really major milestones to look for in kids. And they also start to understand general social expectations. If they're coming, if you're seeing a child that has generally had a very stable, generally pretty safe upbringing, you see that they've started to internalize rules and expectations. So you might see that in kids independently remembering to say things like please and thank you, or perhaps kids who have the ability to take turns and not have fights with other kids. You can start to see this happening in toddlerhood, and these gains build on each other in early childhood. And kids are also cognitively having bigger thoughts about the world, their place in the world, how the world works. They're starting to imitate other people, make their own plans, and as I mentioned a moment ago, being aware of rules, which helps them build skills of self-control and a sense of safety. Rules can be a drag sometimes because you want something and somebody tells you no, but rules can also be a source of safety and comfort because you get the picture that there are adults in your life that are making you safe. And so while kids might test all of these rules, you can often see that there's an appreciation when adults hold the line and adults establish a safe structure for kids wherever they might be. So there is an additional video lecture entirely about attachment, and I'll make a few comments about that now, but most of that content will be in the other video lecture. But attachments begin prenatally. They continue obviously through birth and infancy. attachment and attachment theory are really very crucial to understanding how kids grow and develop. And one of the things that they're getting through secure attachments is this idea of affect regulation, that somebody can help them interpret a new experience, help them anticipate things. Scaffolding refers to kind of preparation. And so here would be an example. Kids in toddlerhood have um, very little ability to independently have any kind of emotional regulation. They're pretty dependent still on the adults around them to help them manage their emotions and their affect. And they're young, they're they have some new cognitive skills, but they're still very new. They don't necessarily understand what happens. And so an example of an overwhelming experience for a child, say, might be going to the pediatrician for a physical. And if at some point in the past there was a vaccine or a blood test or some other kind of unpleasant thing, what you can see then is kids developing kind of a fear around toddlerhood of going for medical appointments, really around anything, because they start to be afraid, say, of shots. And so the secure base is the parent or caregivers that spend the most time with the child generally, and they're going to look for that secure base when you start to talk about tomorrow we're going to go to the doctor's office. The first thing they do is look at this parent or caregiver, and maybe they cry or maybe they protest, but if the parent or caregiver can help them manage their affect and reassure them and communicate understanding that sometimes people don't like to go and sometimes people have experiences there that they don't like, and they understand that, then that goes a long way for affect regulation. Reminders that the parent is going to stay with them the whole time, that helps affect regulation. A lot of reassurance, a lot of talking about how brave and strong they were in the past and they will be again, and then some help in interpreting the experience of, say, going to the pediatrician and getting vaccines. Vaccines are something that help us stay healthy. Vaccines are a part of some doctor's visits, but not all doctor's visits. If you happen to be lucky and your upcoming doctor's visits doesn't involve vaccines, you can play that up. But even if it does, you can start to help a child anticipate that. You can say, you're going to sit in my lap and you're going to close your eyes and we're going to imagine a fun and happy thing that we're going to do as soon as the doctor's appointment is over. And if you need to hold my hand, you can hold my hand. These are secure based behaviors, affect regulation behaviors, helping a child interpret that experience and then helping them anticipate the event that's about to happen and giving them some preparation and planning about how they're going to manage that. So that is one small example of the secure based behavior in attachments, but there's so many experiences like that in childhood. Maybe it's the first day at daycare or the first day at a new school, or maybe it's the first time a child is really aware that things like thunderstorms happen, or maybe that experience is the death of a pet or a family member. There's so many experiences in toddlerhood that can be overwhelming, that require attachment figures to do the things that we were just speaking about a minute ago. And that leads to the very problematic effects of depressed or somehow unavailable parents. A depressed parent just doesn't have the energy to engage with a child in a way that would build strong attachments. And so you see children of depressed parents often seeming very anxious, very hard to calm down, a lot of affect dysregulation in themselves. There's some theories that suggest that parents who are depressed have children who are kind of manic or hyper, and these children often get misdiagnosed with something like ADHD, when in fact the behavior that that child is expressing is really meant to engage and enliven a depressed parent, trying to just sort of pull them out of that dark cloud that they're stuck in. And the same is true for parents who are unavailable, and they may be unavailable because they're absent, or they may be unavailable because they have to work two jobs in order to, keep their family financially stable, or other things, which makes the social support that a child has even more important. If their primary caregiver is overwhelmed or depressed or working two jobs or in some other way is unavailable, then that puts new emphasis on a grandparent, an extended family member, a sibling, a close friend of the family. Somebody has to step into that role to help a child, especially a toddler, because what you see, if that's not happening, are kids who have pretty intense um, dysregulation in terms of emotional dysregulation and behavioral dysregulation. And another important milestone in toddlerhood is the ability of a child who hopefully has a secure base with a small group of consistent caregivers. You start to see them use that attachment relationship to help self-regulate. And so that's where things like transitional objects come into play, or that's where you see children acting out in pretend to play positive and reassuring and nurturing scenes. um, the cognitive skill of increased memory also helps toddlers cope with separation. They can remember that the school day or the daycare day might be long, but the caregiver drops them off and a caregiver will pick them up. Or they can remember how 3 days ago they really missed their caregiver and then they sat in their teacher's lap and read a book and they felt better. So the cognitive ability that comes with toddlerhood also helps them use that attachment relationship for soothing and self-regulation. So cognitive development, again, a growing awareness, these cognitive expectations, the world is starting to be organized, they're starting to understand how family and intermediate environment is affecting them, how culture might be affecting them. But one of the biggest milestones probably of toddlerhood is the ability to now use the word no, because differentiation is made pretty easy when somebody just says no. So you ask a child to come join you at the dinner table, no. You ask a child to try to go to the bathroom before you get in the car, no. So this use of the word no is probably one of the bigger hallmarks of toddlerhood. And while for parenting it might be kind of annoying sometimes, it is actually a very big positive development in toddlers. And so toddlers are still very little, obviously. We're talking about kids between the ages of 1 and 3. The parents are still the main mediator and influence in the world. And so they're starting to experiment with other things and they're starting to become aware of other things, but they're always going to be turning to the parents and primary caregivers to understand the world. They're going to look for reassurance, what to expect, all of those kinds of things. And while they're always going to be looking to that parent or caregiver to help them understand things and make sense of things, they also are having more self-awareness about aspects of their own identity. So, for example, the beginning signs of gender identity, say, or racial identity, these things are starting to form in a child's experience, and you see that then start to play out at different stages along development. So one of the other major milestones of toddlerhood is developing the ability to speak clearly and use language and communication to help meet your needs. And so part of this is brain development, as you can see in some of these bullet points. And around the 2-year mark, right when, that sort of quote unquote terrible 2 time might be starting, you start to see toddlers understand that language can be a way to understand emotions. And so this is where, a child might tell you that they're really, really mad or they're very happy, and they start to have some words for the things that they feel. At 2 years old, you would expect to see 2 and 3 word sentences, but by 3 years old, you would expect to see a much larger vocabulary with different uses of tenses, and you can see that kids can rely on words rather than pointing and gesturing. And as kids gain mastery of language and communication, what you also see, hopefully, is that their frustration is going down, and any aggressive behaviors that you might have seen earlier in toddlerhood might be getting better, because as kids um, get better at being able to express themselves, ideally some of that reactive aggression also goes down. This last point is kind of interesting. One of the things that I'm sure we will all talk about in all of our classes is the fact that development is kind of uneven. And so, for example, you might have a kid who's very tall. They're often mistaken as being older. They are advanced, you might say, in their physical development, but that doesn't necessarily mean that advanced physical development is matched by advanced emotional and social development. And so sometimes kids get misunderstood if parts of them are differently developing than other parts of them. And so, for example, this last bullet point talks about if kids appear to have a really great or above average grasp of language and the ability to speak and communicate, that might lead adults around that child to have unrealistic expectations because they're still a toddler. They may have had some great gains in language and communication, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they've had huge gains in affect regulation, say, or social skills. So it's interesting when you think about the power that comes with language. It allows children, very young children, to speak and be understood and organize things and have different kinds of complicated interaction. Language is a tool for labeling and understanding and processing emotions and impulses. It's a way of representing reality and yourself, both to yourself and others. And storytelling, which is a really wonderful way to communicate with children, reading to them and just sort of narrative storytelling, is really rich in communicating to kids values, cultural expectations, social expectations, general parental expectations, learning, imagination, all of this really great stuff, both from the adults who are engaging with the child to tell a story, and also if the child then can tell a story back. And as a parent, it's also kind of a relief for your child to be able to communicate clearly with you. So rather than trying to understand some strange behavior, a child can come up to you and say, I'm hungry right now. I want milk, or some kind of expression so that the guesswork, so to speak, is taken out of parenting a little bit more. And that's a huge relief for a lot of parents when their children can be able to communicate more clearly with them. The other thing that the development of language does is it becomes a way to communicate limitations and expectation. Kids of this age, sometimes while they may have greater language, they don't necessarily know what's true, quote unquote, and what's lying, quote unquote. So we've spoken about this already, but one of the potential impact of any child that's suffering a language delay is that they can be more impulsive, more frustrated, and more behavioral displays of emotion because they can't communicate, and it's frustrating. So language and culture and how language is used in culture is really, really interesting. Some cultures are very verbal, and a lot of communication happens in a verbal way. Some cultures might be less verbal and quieter, but there might be more physical affection and physical contact. So it can be interesting when you're working with clients to see how language and communication is expressed differently depending on the cultural background of the family that you're working with. Different expectations around how you communicate in different social settings. What messages, for example, is a toddler receiving if they are more or less verbal, and how is that valued or not valued by the culture? And so I think we're also going to talk about, in different classes, the impact of socioeconomic factors in language development. One study that is really very interesting talks about the number of words that a child hears before the age of 5 years old, say, for example. And the more words, not necessarily that they hear around them, but that are spoken directly to them in the form of conversation or questions or reading or some other kind of interaction where an adult is actually verbally interacting with the child. And there's been some pretty strong evidence that says the more a child is engaged verbally with a caregiver or an adult, the better language development they're going to have, which translates usually into uh, better emotional development, better readiness for school. It has these implications kind of all along development. So, what could be some socioeconomic factors in how many words, literally, a parent or caregiver says to a child every day? Some of that might just strictly be down to the amount of time that a parent has to spend with their child. Are they working? Are they working long hours? When they come home, are they exhausted? They're letting the kids have some TV time because they want some TV time because they're just so tired. So these might be, for example, families who are not directly talking to their children, say, as often or as much as another family that has more resources and less stressed caregivers. So these kinds of social situations also affect things like language development and all of the things that are related to language development. So 2-year-olds, for example, they have their terrible 2 label. So emotional development is starting, you could say. But clearly there's no toddler that probably would win any major awards for being fabulously emotionally developed at that age. That happens later. I don't know, hopefully by middle age maybe. But you can start to see some skill building around emotional development and emotional regulation at toddlerhood. So you start to, and again, this goes back to talking to kids, but the more you can talk to kids or read to kids or expose toddlers to conversations about emotions, that helps them understand feelings and helps them hopefully be less overwhelmed by these feelings. And then around 2 or 3, later in toddlerhood, you see some of these secondary emotions, like the ones that are listed here, taking over a child, or a child being able to access some words or some understanding of those emotions. And there's an interesting kind of cultural point here that social and emotional understanding comes earlier in societies that are more communal, and textbooks that we have previously used in this class use Japan, for example, as often an example of that when there's more expectation of interdependency and more language around that and more emphasis on emotional regulation for the good of the group, that tends to help kids build those skills earlier. And so previously in infancy, we were talking about sensory motor play. You can see much more of that in the beginning of toddlerhood, and then towards the end of toddlerhood, you start to see more pretend and symbolic play. And so these pretend and symbolic play are more abstract, and they are more representative of the kinds of things that the child has in their world that they're playing out in their play. And so you can certainly see what that child is grappling with in their world through their play. And so that might be gender role expectations, that might be individual conflicts with individual people, that might be issues with authority. For example, if children are going to play school, for example, who always wants to be the teacher, who always is the bad kid in class, some of these themes. And so sensory motor play is just kind of figuring things out, but pretend and symbolic play really kind of give you a window into that child's world and the kinds of stuff that they're thinking about and grappling with. And that can be really interesting. One of the things I think that gets misunderstood with children a lot of times is that play doesn't really mean a whole lot. Play is actually really, really, really important, and I'm going to embed some video clips here in a few moments that hopefully will highlight that. Again, pretend play, it enhances coping. Oftentimes, pretend play lessens anxiety that children feel. It helps them feel calmer. It gives them an outlet. And so What you might see in pretend play is a lot of intensity followed by more regulation because they've kind of expressed what they need to express. Certainly anybody that plays with children, does social work with children is going to want to have some training in play therapy. It's an enormous therapeutic tool. And it's another way, play, to express what's going on culturally within a family. So Winnicott, one of the famous pieces of theory that come out of Winnicott is this idea of a transitional object, and that object is a symbol of an attachment relationship that is soothing. And an object like that can take on sort of magical powers that can help a child through a hard time. And it's also something that that toddler can control. One of the things that I'm always telling parents is that if a child starts to develop an attachment or a transitional object with a teddy bear or a binky or a blankie or some object like that, parents, you probably want to make sure that you have about 10 of those things hidden somewhere in your house so that if something ever happens to the one, you can immediately produce another. But the loss of the transitional object, if it gets lost at the airport or forgotten at the store or something along that line, is a pretty bad day, so to speak, for a toddler and their family. But they can do that now. They can use that they have the cognitive ability and the emotional ability to understand the significance of this particular object, whatever it might be, in helping them feel better. And it's a really helpful tool with children. So one of the things that is very common in infancy and in toddlerhood and in early childhood is this concept of regression. And what that essentially refers to is that all of this new stuff and all of this intense development is happening, and sometimes you just have a regression. You backslide. Maybe you're tired or you're sick or you're overwhelmed, and so then what you see then is children kind of reverse some of the gains they made, at least temporarily. And so you might see a child who has never had a toileting accident suddenly have a toileting accident. You might see a child who seems to have moved out of temper tantrums going back and having temper tantrums, those kinds of things. And oftentimes there is a regression in toddlerhood right before there's a developmental burst. And so, for example, you might suddenly have a child who's regressing around toilet training or regressing around temper tantrums, and they're having all kinds of problems that you thought that you were beyond. And then next week you're noticing that they've had a tremendous language burst, and instead of 1 or 2 word sentences, they're talking in 3 or 4 word sentences. So it's pretty common in toddlers to see a regression followed by all of a sudden a big advance in some area of their development. So there's all kinds of potential problems in toddlerhood. The kids who don't have a secure base and are struggling with issues of attachment, and that's going to come out, I think, more in the next lecture around attachment theory. Different delays in social or communication abilities, language. This is, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of issues around frustration, and toddlerhood can be a really challenging time for parents. It asks you as a parent to probably shift your strategy, shift your parenting style. And if you don't really understand kids and you don't really know what to expect from your toddler, you might, as a parent, mishandle situations and think that situations are problematic when actually they're actually pretty normal. And so working with families of toddlers is really important to support parents in the challenge of having toddlers, but also to be helping them understand what's typical behavior and what is kind of reasonable to expect, even though it might be hard. I certainly don't know anybody that really enjoys going through their toddler's temper tantrums, but if you are able to understand the importance of a temper tantrum in the big picture, then maybe that might help you, for example, handle that more, handle that better, give the child what they need. I'm going to embed a couple of video clips here in talking about children and what they're experiencing. One of them is a a video about pretend play, so that can be kind of highlighted. And you can see, I think, some of the stuff that we have been talking about in that. And the next clip is, it's an older clip. The family that's being highlighted is a family from probably the late 80s. So you might have to sort of look beyond the fashion, perhaps, of 1989, but stay focused on what excellent parents these people are to their very young children. If we were trying to give an example of ideal parenting for a toddler, even in the challenging times of raising a toddler, I think these people would be probably the best example I've seen in a long time. So the first clip, you're going to see issues around pretend, not issues rather, but an example of pretend play. And in the second clip, you'll see the Goldston family from New York dealing with their very overexcited children on Christmas Day. So that gives a little bit of explanation about these clips that you're going to see here in a moment.
Jack, how would you like to be greeted today?
I like to
Handshake? Okay.
I was going to be the teacher today.
Yeah, handshake. Thank you, Jack. Go ahead.
Show. Parents who use a lot of harsh control and show very little warmth tend to have children who are aggressive in the playground. So also do parents who use very little control, even though they show quite a lot of warmth. The parents whose children are least aggressive are those who use a moderate amount of reasoned control and show at least a moderate amount of warmth.
Warmth and reasoned control are the family script at the Goldston house. Everywhere, families reflect their communities and cultures. In their easy relations with each other, the Golstons seem to personify qualities that Americans like to think of as their best: open, fair, good-humored.
You could have fried chicken and we could have been eating.
Anita spent the whole day in preparation.
You've been missing something, Nina. Yeah, what you missing?
Felton in cooking dinner.
No, you just laughing at me, huh? Cheese. I'm too tired to eat, actually. Well,
The Golston children benefit from an instinctive concern for the rights of every member of the family,
I cooked it all day, now I don't want it.
and from a sense that obligations must be fulfilled.
Oh, yeah.
Several times, Felton promised Benjamin that they would set up the new toy train.
As soon as I finish, we'll put the tray out. Come on.
Where's the
All right.
take you out, boo?
Get up here. Okay?
That's
Give me a
what.
hug.
That's what I'm
Give me a hug.
Most parents can remember making rash promises like Felton's.
Woo, look at that. Oh, I love this kind of stuff. Baby, you got a baby?
Day soon dissolved into night,
Good night, girl. It was wonderful.
and Christmas was over.
Night, everybody.
Parents' good intentions and children's great expectations passed in the dark.
We'll make it. It's all right. Say good night, everybody.
Bedtime, and the trains were still not set up.
Okay, sit down. So you can see. You have to look at this, Benjamin, because the pictures in this book are really, really beautiful. Look. A long time ago. Benji, how can you listen if you're going to sing?
In the children's eager minds, Felton's promise had become a deal.
After this book, we can make a deal.
What are we going to make a deal about?
The train set.
Well, hopefully Daddy will be back, and we'll find out whether or not that's something that you guys are going to do tonight. We'll see. Can I finish now?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, we can show you it, okay?
Let's wait till Daddy gets
We think of siblings mostly as rivals, but they can also be allies, role models, and supportive of each other.
Sorry, do you want to
Hey,
finish
Mom,
sharing those
it's
stories?
you go
Okay.
do this.
Okay. Come here, Daddy. Did you tell them that you were going to set up the train set tonight?
Well, I did kind of stick myself into that position.
Oh, well, we're going to have to undo that. They can't stay up till you do that.
Please. Please.
Arthur, what time is it?
Sit in.
No. It's much too late. You have to go to bed. I don't know what you're getting up for.
The children feel betrayed, their deal broken.
No, you said. Angie. Oh. Deliver me. Oh, wait. Not everybody. Not everybody. I love it. Arthur.
Okay, guys, come on now. One bathroom. One bathroom. All right, we gotta talk about the train, guys.
Yeah. Okay.
Come here. All right. I know, Dad promised you all day that I would put the train together. I did. Dad was cooking. That's my got the cooking knife. Blew it. I know. But I'll put the train together tonight. And I'll put it together tonight. And tomorrow when you wake up, the train will be together. Okay? Okay, so make yourself sick, alright? So you gotta make the bed up. not nice.
That's not nice, buddy.
Just a little bit. Okay?
That's not nice of you.
Felton had to work the next day, but he stayed up until 3 in the morning anyway, putting the trains together. In the example of their father, the Golston children learned that promises bind both powerful giants and the weak and little ones.
I think it's very vital to try and keep the promises. A, I show them respect, that I do respect them, I do feel that they have self-worth. And B, they feel that they don't feel neglected, they don't feel left out. They don't feel that I don't care about them, and I do.
Where was Daddy sleeping?
Daddy went to work.
He couldn't go to bed.
Who couldn't go to bed?
Daddy.
Why?
Because he been very tired.
You want to have some breakfast?